Welcome to our next session here in Unit 2. We are on Session 8, Adjusting to the Spirit's Way. My name is Benjamin Bixler. I am a PhD student at Drew Theological School studying Biblical Studies. And I'm also a teacher at Eastern Mennonite School, where I teach Bible here, located in Harrisonburg, Virginia.
And I'm Megan Westra. I'm an author, and I am also a high school teacher based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Great. So this week, our text is the Jerusalem Council, that fun event in Acts chapter 15, where they're trying to finally sort out this major issue that they've had. We were talking last week about Peter's vision with Cornelius and sort of this inclusiveness. And are we going to actually open this movement up to people who are Gentiles? Or if they want to come in, what are we going to do with them? How are we going to force them to become circumcised and take on this sort of symbol of Jewish practice, or at least the men being forced to take on this practice of, or this symbol of Jewish identity. So we'll dive into this week. One of the things that I think is really interesting here in this passage that strikes me, I taught this past year in a church history class. And one of the activities that I took for my curriculum was mapping out the 4 different perspectives that are laid out in this chapter are really interesting to look at. You have these Judeans who are concerned about what Paul's up to in these areas outside of Jerusalem. So they sort of tell on him a little bit, sort of say, hey, do you all know what he's really doing? Then we get the perspective of Peter, who we had just met in chapter 11, who seems to be all about including Gentiles. Then we get Barnabas and Paul, who are the ones who sort of initiated this whole controversy. And then lastly, we get James, brother of Jesus, who comes in and sort of gives this final word with his, therefore I have reached the decision. And then we end up with this sort of consensus after the fact, but it seems as though James has a lot of power to sort of influence how they all want to do this. And what I find really interesting here is that this whole council is started by a few Judeans who aren't liking the work that Paul and Barnabas and then Peter as well are doing. And so it only takes a few of these people to sort of derail and sort of sidetrack some of their energy in the efforts that they're doing to make this group more expansive, to tell the Gentiles that, yes, we want you to come in, we want you to come in. And there's just these few people who are sort of hung up on, this isn't the way we usually do things, or this isn't the way, like, you normally haven't been allowed in. And so 3 of these 4 groups that are represented in Acts 15 are actually the ones who are pushing us forward. We talked last week about this trajectory sort of inclusion. And I think there's just something like powerful in this idea that, like, when we actually sit down and we look at this, no, I think everyone's understanding that this is our trajectory. And so that was sort of one of the things I just wanted to throw on the table, that the majority of the people here seem to sense that the Spirit is moving people in this direction, away from these exclusionary practices of requiring circumcision for Gentiles as they come in. So Megan, I don't want to talk for too long here. So I don't know if you have anything you want to throw in there, or places you wanted to jump in or see.
Well, thank goodness a few loud people don't get to sidetrack things anymore. I'm really glad that we moved past that. I think that I love that you brought in, in talking about that like when they sat down and talked to each other, when you got everybody together, it was actually like, oh, okay, well, more of us are on the same page than we thought we were. And so I think often in my experience, if I'm feeling like there's a lot of conflict in the air, if I've got one of those people in my ear that has a lot of opinions about how things are going, it can be so easy to fixate on that and be like, oh my gosh, everybody hates this, or everybody's really upset. But to think instead about, what if we actually all sat down? Like if you're saying this, and usually they're telling you this about somebody else, because people love a good triangle. What if we actually sat down and talked? Let's just go talk to that person. And I do this with my students sometimes. There's never any drama in high school. But if I'm hearing from one student about another student, or I'm hearing from a teacher about a student that we may both have, to just say, well, why don't we all sit down? And I would say 8 times out of 10, that just brings all of the air out of it. And it's like, no, good. It's not that big of a deal. I'm like, oh, okay. But for those couple times where then it does lead to that conversation, there's so much good that comes out of that really uncomfortable, like, let's just bring this to a head. We're all going to sit down. We're all going to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives this opportunity for mutual discernment of what is God actually doing here. In this passage anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It gives this opportunity to look at like values that we may hold in common, even if we're living them out in different ways, or to notice the incongruence with the value that we have with what we're actually doing.
Yeah.
It takes this really like noxious, spiraling, like hurricane of anxiety and conflict, and instead says like, what if we just gave it a really good soaking rain? Like instead of a hurricane, what if it was just this like really good like rainstorm that like went down deep and replenished the water tables? And I don't know if that metaphor makes any sense. We had a really big storm last night in Wisconsin, and so I'm thinking about like how happy my garden is right now. Yeah. But like, I think we can be so afraid of the storms sometimes that we miss that like, no, but this could invite us to such a deep, nourishing place if we would only be willing to sit down and talk with each other and figure out like, okay, who's just the really loud voice who there's only a couple of those and they're really loud, and maybe we just need like, okay, thank you. Yep. And what is God actually trying to do with all of us who didn't even know we were on the same page, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right. Like we had this idea that conflict is this bad thing, at least, especially in the Mennonite, I guess I grew up brother in Christ. So these Anabaptist circles, I'll put them, like we tend to be conflict averse, even like as we talk about doing things like conflict transformation and that sort of thing. But when we actually sit down and we try to hash things out, like we actually get somewhere. And like the Jerusalem Council shows us that. Like, so like the outcome is, first of all, that people are empowered to go do their work, like they're blessed and sort of sent. But then they also sort of clarify, interestingly enough, around a couple of sort of core common beliefs. And this was an activity I looked at with my high school students this past year, was like, so they named 4 essential beliefs that, maybe we don't want to hold on to, that we don't even understand, in terms of like things polluted by idols, fornication, whatever has been strangled, and from blood. Like there's a lot to unpack and sort of why those 4, like that was significant to your faith in this moment. Like that's what everyone has to adhere to. But anyway, I think it can be a productive conversation to say, well, if we were to sit down and say, what are our essential things that we want to send people out with, and say, these are the things you need to pay attention to. Like a decent activity that you could even do this week would be, say, like if we had to come up with 4 values that we hold to, what are they? Because that's one of the things that comes out of this process of conflict, is that they say, well, no, we're caring about these 4 things. And then you're empowered to go do this, Paul, and whoever's going to go with you. And Peter, you're empowered to go do this. And the rest of us are going to be empowered to do this. And so when we've talked about this idea of unity throughout this entire summer. And so like, how do we have unity around that while still blessing people to go do what they need to do, even if it doesn't look like what I think it should look like for me? And so to me, I think it's also a powerful example of how that conflict brings about unity of a type that allows people to follow the Spirit's leading where they need to go.
I just want to say that it was actually the Mennonites who taught me that conflict wasn't scary. Okay. I'm not Good. Mennonite. I didn't grow up in any sort of Anabaptist tradition. And then I took a conflict transformation class with the Lombard Mennonite Peace Center when I was in seminary. And it changed my life. And I was like, oh, this is not scary. So I will, I feel like I need to offer that up as like, yes, maybe like if you're in the camp, it's like, oh my gosh, we're bad at this, but certainly like other types of Protestants are even worse at it. So.
I don't know that we have a corner on that, but yeah.
But I think I love the idea of naming the values. Like, what are the 4, and bringing it down to like, what are like 3 or 4, like, because I think that, and I did this practice with some of my students in a bioethics class, of saying like, what are, first it was like, what are your 10 most essential values if you're thinking about, decisions in healthcare or things like that, which is what we were centering on. But then to make them narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down, like, well, what are 5? What are 2? what's the one value that if you can't compromise on this?
Mhm.
And they were like, this is so hard. I was like, yeah, that's the point. Like if you can list off endless values that are the essentials for your community, like, well, anybody can do that. But how do you build consensus, and how do you say, no, these are the most essential, these are the things we don't negotiate on? And even thinking about, like, in this passage, those that they did name, which, you know, you have to do a lot of like working on, like, okay, why was it these? But to ask that question of like, why was it these particular things? You know, when we think about what are the values that are non-negotiable for us, why are those the ones that are non-negotiable? And like, what trajectory do they put us on? What does it say about the distinctiveness of our community? What message is that sending? Because that's what's going on here with these particular ones that they picked out. It's questions of like trajectory and distinctiveness. It's you know, power dynamics and all of these things, allegiances. And so when I think about, you know, what are the values that I consider to be like most crucial, what are the deal breakers, what are the ones that we have to hold on to if we're going to maintain faithfulness, that those can't just be like my personal like pet values, right? Like it can't be like, well, I like this style of music and I want, you know, there has to be good coffee because value of hospitality, right? Like, you know, it has to be like, no, really, like what are the most essential? What are the non-negotiables? And that those need to be driven by these trajectories of inclusion, these trajectories of shared life, shared resource. They need to be values that are in these trajectories of allegiance to Christ, not empire. And those are all things that we need to be moving to the center. You know, however we phrase those today, less about, you know, strangulation and things like that now. But how do we phrase those things today, and how do we move those to the center? And if they can't fit in the center, then what do we need to be like reorienting, right? I think that there's sometimes this temptation to just be like, oh, we're going to move this to the center. And we forget that there's already something there. Like all communities are centered around something. And so if that's not in the center, you can't just move it there. You have to move something out. And that's the hard bit, is moving the other thing out so that this new thing can move in.
Yeah, but I think, that to me, that connects with how the story ends. I forget if it's in the passage that we had here, if we go into the response of the people from Antioch. I don't think we do. But one of the things you can do in the lesson this week is to look at how the people from Antioch respond. So Paul, or I guess it's not Paul, Silas and whoever else gets sent up to take this message from the Jerusalem Council back up to the people of Antioch, who are the people we've been talking about who weren't present in the meeting. And the lesson talks about that, how there's issues of power and who's represented and who speaks for those people on the margins, which I think are important questions that you can really delve into. But like you said, what are we setting aside so that we can center it? And then I think the test of that is, how do the people on the margins, maybe even the people who haven't been centered, how are they responding to the work that we've done? Like, and so you read about the people of Antioch, like they're excited, they're joyful, like they celebrate the fact, I mean, part of it is like, yes, we don't have to undergo circumcision to continue to be in the church. So like, yeah, that's, you know, my students always laugh when we try to talk through this kind of stuff. But yeah, like there's a practical element to that, but it's also like, they're liberated, they're freed. And so I think when we think about how we come to what these core values are and what are we requiring of people to be a part of our communities, it should be freeing and liberating, not a burden placed upon them. And that's one of the things that I really like about this as we follow it into the response of the people they're actually talking about. We see a lifting of something off of them rather than adding more to them. And so to me, that's the movement of the Spirit. Again, this trajectory of saying, you belong, you're a part of us, and we're not going to require you to do anything to be something that you're not. Like we invite you in as you are. So to me, that's the really powerful message coming out of this when we sort of follow that story to its effects immediately there at the end of chapter 15.
Yeah, no, I love that. And this lifting of burdens, is freeing up. And even if we like think about, you know, going back to, you know, a couple of sessions ago, like holding things in common, things like that, like all of that, like if you're holding things together, like all of that is freeing you up. All of that is like alleviating, right? And so just becoming less bound up in either oppression and systems that others have imposed on you, but also being freed up from feeling this like, I have to hold this all on my own, and I have to keep all of these rules. If I think about like kosher rules or things like that, or Peter's like agonizing over like, if I had been Peter, even if I had been like going to that table and being like, okay, God said, and I believe, and so I am here, I would have also been like, I would go back home and be like, okay, but do I need to do the purification ritual too, just in case, right? Like I would have definitely been in this like kind of uneasy space of like, I know God said, but also I have all this other like stuff going on in my head. And so just thinking about like even being liberated or freed up from this, our own personal, like, I feel like I have to hold this all together.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that there's this piece in the lesson about silence as spiritual practice too. And I think that that plays such a role here too, right? That we've talked a lot in this session about, if you sit down and talk to people, like good things happen. And, if you actually bring people to the table, but also to remember that like sometimes that silence is key too, right? Or the space is important too, that there is also the danger of just being like, we're just going to talk everything out, which is probably more of my bias at this point in my life of like, we'll just keep talking. And so thinking too about like the role of silence in formation as well. And so I wonder, before we wrap up, if there's anything that you want to add on that front of what role does silence play in navigating some of these shifts as well?
Yeah, no, that's good. I don't know that it fits in exactly, but one of the things that I've been reflecting on, sort of looking at the power dynamics involved in this, and like who gets to be present and who gets to speak and who has a voice. And so this idea of silence is, some people are sort of forced into that silence, and others of us have the choice as to whether we want to be silent or not. Those of us with privilege who get to come to the table and, choose whether we're going to speak and lay some of our ideas on the table that might be risky or whatever. And so that's sort of how I was thinking about that. Like, when is the right time to be silent? When is it that, we actually are silent, we listen to the work of the Holy Spirit? And I think that's definitely evident in places before this, like Peter's dream in chapter 11 is this time that, like, he's by himself, and that's often when we hear the work of the Spirit. And so in preparation for things like a Jerusalem Council, there's also those other moments where we need to be preparing for that, so that we can hear that Spirit's movement as we enter into those spaces.
Good. I like it. That's great. Right. So as you are preparing this week, or as you're engaging with the lesson, taking that time to do the talking, but also the silence, and thinking about which voices you're centering in the conversation. What does the work you're doing contribute to the community? And so that you have a great week, and we will be back with you again next week.